Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I'm the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov. We're very privileged to have a guest on from Canada today. Very important subject, one that's very much in the news in light of some recent developments in both the NBA and Major League Baseball. We've got Jeremy Luke, who is the CEO and president of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, CCES. Jeremy, welcome and thanks for joining us on our podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Rich. Glad to be here.
So just 24 hours ago, we learned of a lifetime ban for a Major League Baseball player, a member of the Pirates named Tucupita Marcano. That, of course, comes after it was discovered that he was betting on Major League Baseball. We all know about the Jonte Porter ban from the NBA, also resulting from betting on basketball in that case. So this is something that continues to happen. There was also a one-year suspension of an Oakland Athletic. There's a couple of minor leaguers who were suspended. So obviously this continues to happen in sports across the board. Jeremy, tell me first of all what the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport is.
Thanks again for having me on the show. The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport is it's a private, nonprofit organization that's independent from sport and independent from government. And our mission really is to make sport better. And we do that through four main areas that I'll quickly highlight for you. The first is the work that we do in anti-doping and protecting athletes from the risk of doping. And then we deal with competition manipulation, which is the topic that you want to discuss today, and making sure athletes are safe from that issue. And we also deal with grassroots education campaigns around values in sport and trying to help the sport community in Canada wrestle with emerging integrity-related issues. So that's the focus of our organization, really trying to make sport better.
So when it comes to sport betting specifically, that was legalized in Canada not so long ago. What are some of the concerns that were first raised when this was made legal? And have you seen some of those concerns realized?
Great question. So sports betting was legalized a couple of years ago. From a Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport perspective, we supported the legalization of single event sport betting. We did so through the lens that type of betting is occurring in sport anyway. It's better to get it out of the shadows, to regulate it, to license it, and to try and put in place mechanisms to be able to detect when competition manipulation and issues like that happen, and to reduce the harm that can be caused from sports betting. So that was the approach that we took. What I would say is the challenge is that the legalization occurred quite quickly, but there are still a lot of steps that need to be put in place to protect athletes and protect participants from the harms associated with sport gambling, and in particular, the risks around potential manipulation of competitions and athletes being caught up in that space.
So sports betting, since it was legalized in many states here in the United States, obviously has taken off. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, whereas a lot of the professional sports leagues shied away from gambling. They now have embraced them all, full throttle, and are partners with a lot of gambling entities. How, being a rabid sports fan myself and a Canadian, and I'm a huge fan of, a couple of my Canadian teams, how do you compare sports betting in Canada to the U.S.? I mean, has it approached the level it is here, or is it still kind of a growing trend there?
No, I would say it's absolutely taken off. And with the legalization of single event sport betting, the proliferation of advertising that you see, at major league sport levels in Canada is really concerning, frankly. But the level of sports betting, the fact that you can wager on so many different aspects of sport beyond the outcome of the competition, but all of the different parts of competitions, has driven up, betting interest, has driven up people's exposure to betting. It's driven a kind of normalization of betting. And that's a real challenge when it comes to sport and it comes to protecting the integrity of sport. And as we look at this issue, it comes to protecting the safety of those people who are participating in sport from being corrupted or groomed into doing things they might not otherwise do, given the money involved.
So there is no national level policy with regards to sports betting. What are some of the problems with that fact? What's missing right now from a sweeping program at the national level in Canada?
That's something we've been advocating for quite some time, is to put in place a national set of rules that set out what you can bet on, what you can't bet on, what to do if you're approached to manipulate a competition, who do you report that to, what agency is charged with investigating these types of things, and educating athletes around these risks. That hasn't been put in place. We've been working hard to try and get it to be put in place, and we've made some advancements with the development of a draft policy with a number of our national sport organizations. But what's really needed is a policy that's mandated by our federal government that would require federally funded sport organizations to have a policy in place that sets out those types of prohibited behaviors associated with betting and educates athletes around those risks. At the professional level, I mean, to give them some credit, I mean, they have put in place those policies, which is why I think you're seeing some of these cases being, uncovered and reported, and then, that type of activity discipline. But at the national level, I would say those organizations are far behind with respect to having those types of policies and those types of, monitoring and investigative practices in place to uncover this type of thing from happening.
We all know in the sports space that kids are starting to play sports earlier than ever. Advertisers obviously want to influence future consumers' buying habits as early as possible. Those two things can result in many problems when it comes to sports betting, particularly among young athletes. What kind of messaging are you doing? What's your mission with regards to reaching young athletes, perhaps before they reach the professional status, but in terms of communicating with them some of the dangers in sports manipulation and, sports betting?
Well, it comes down to education for sure. It comes down to wanting to make sure that those people who participate in sport, whether it's a national level or in our case, provincial level or a state level in the United States, not only do those organizations have policies, but that they have really comprehensive education programs and resources and materials so that young athletes and young participants in sport understand these risks and understand where to go to get assistance if they need it. So, it's really important and incumbent on all of us that on the one hand, there's the legalization of single event sport betting. On the other, we need to put in place practices to protect participants, young participants, from the risks associated with competition manipulation.
So, Jeremy, does there exist currently in Canada any laws pertaining to how you can market and promote gambling platforms? And if there are, do you feel like they should be stronger?
Currently in Canada, gambling is regulated at a provincial level, again, similar to the US and the state level. And the challenge we have now is that it's different from province to province to province with respect to what are those rules, what are the regulations associated with advertising, with which sports you could bet on, with how you go about betting, with licensing betting operators and how that process works. So there's quite a difference across the country. What we've been advocating for is that our federal government ratifies the Macklin Convention, which is a Council of Europe convention that over 30 countries have signed on to and are working their way through. It's essentially a way for a framework to be put in place in Canada that puts consistent regulations across all of our provinces around sports betting, and in particular, how to deal with the issue of competition manipulation. And that's what we think is needed.
So joining the Macklin Convention seems to be a no-brainer. What are the obstacles to getting Canada to sign on? I assume, of course, that the gambling lobby is, very well funded. They are very strong in Canada as they are in the U.S., and there's a lot of money that is being spent against such regulations. That's got to be part of the issue, correct?
Well, right now the government of Canada is considering the Macklin Convention. You need to ask them the rationale for why they haven't got to that place yet of moving down the road of ratifying it. But that's essentially what is needed in order to be able to deal with this issue effectively across each of our provinces and in putting in place the regulations that are needed. The steps that are outlined in the Macklin Convention are regulations at a provincial level, but it includes things like ensuring there are laws in place that deal with competition manipulation, ensuring it's in our criminal code, as an example, ensuring that law enforcement can effectively investigate these issues, since we know that competition manipulation can be tied to organized crime and money laundering and other issues that they're using sport to be able to take advantage of. So those are the benefits of a convention of that nature, is that it pulls other key stakeholders to the table, including sport, to figure out how to wrestle with this issue.
Jeremy, you and your organization, the CCES, have drafted a policy that may deal with some of these issues. Can you explain a little bit more about this policy and the chances of it being widely put in place?
Sure. I mean, what we wanted to do is create one common policy that would apply across all of our sport organizations. And the best way to describe it would be if you think of anti-doping rules in the US or in Canada, you have one set of policies that describes an anti-doping, the prohibited substances, it describes testing protocols and all of those types of things, and it applies to all of your Olympic and Paralympic sports. That's the same sort of thing that's needed in the area of competition manipulation. One policy across all sports that says you can't bet on your sport, you can't trade insider information about your sport to help other people out. There's different things that we can prohibit. There's mandatory reporting, and there's an agency that you can go to if someone approaches you to try and manipulate a competition, since often individuals who are manipulating the competition can be the victim who's being exposed to do it. Where do you go to report those things and to investigate them? And in the area of anti-doping, we've got really strong policies and great agencies like the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport and like the US Anti-Doping Agency. What's needed are agencies like that can deal with this particular issue, given the legalization of single event sport betting, the proliferation of betting, the targeting of minors. That's the type of approach that we need to protect our sports system going forward.
Jeremy, last question here on the SERMAPod, and we really appreciate your time. We've got about 50 days or so before the Summer Olympics in Paris. That's got to be of concern. What do we expect? What do you expect to take place at these games when it comes to the issues that you're discussing?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think people need to realize the volume of money that's wagered on Olympic level sport, and not think that wagering only happens on professional sports like the NBA or the MLB or the NFL. I think the figures regarding the Tokyo 2021 Olympics was that in excess of $12 billion were wagered on those games around the world. So we know betting happens on sports all around the world, and we know that puts our athletes and our sporting participants at risk of competition manipulation. So what needs to happen is making sure that our athletes who attend those games are educated about these risks, that they know what to do if they're approached, that they don't inadvertently make mistakes, and that they are well versed in these issues when they head to Paris. And that is something that our organization has been doing in partnership with the Canadian Olympic Committee, to make sure that Canadian athletes and Canadian participants going to the games realize the extent of this risk and know how to deal with it should they be exposed to it.
Well, as someone who remembers where I was that day that Ben Johnson, famous Canadian sprinter, both won the gold medal over Carl Lewis, that famous call 979. I remember it like it was yesterday, and also remembers where I was exactly less than 2 days later when you saw him being led out through the airport and that gold medal being stripped because he violated anti-doping policies. I agree with you that the Olympics are a major concern when it comes to integrity in sports, and we're hoping that at least that all teams, but at least Team Canada, is abiding by all regulations. Jeremy Luke, thank you so much for your valuable work in this area and for joining us on the SERMAPod.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rich. And what I really hope is that we don't need to have another incident like the one you referenced at the '88 Olympics in order to get traction to deal with the issue of competition manipulation to the level that's needed. Thanks very much for having me.
Really appreciate it.